Good morning and welcome to the forum. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral. It's such a blessing to see all of you here today. Each year, Grace Cathedral chooses a theme, and this year our theme is truth, the truth about ourselves, each other, the world, and God. As our guest today writes, we are facing a lot of trouble on all fronts, and the first step in making positive change is to call out our troubles, our American crises, and call them by their true names. When I was invited to become the Dean of Grace Cathedral, the same day, I thought to myself, wow, that means maybe I'll be able to invite Rebecca Solnit to come over, and she might even come. And I know she's so busy with so many things and working on so many projects, and we love to read your books, so we appreciate you taking some time away from writing books to being with us. But Rebecca Solnit is a writer, historian, and activist. She's a product of the California public education system from kindergarten to graduate school, and the author of 20 books, among them The Mother of All Questions, Hope in the Dark, the international bestseller Men Explain Things to Me, a trilogy of priceless atlases of American cities, and most recently Call Them by Their True Names, which just this week has won the prestigious Kirkus Prize for Nonfiction.
Thank you.
I was going to say, please join me in welcoming Rebecca Solnit, but we're all really well.
Thank you all.
We're very well trained. Thank you so much for being here today. I was telling my wife, I said, it's like a little bit like if you met Robert Redford, but I don't even know if Robert Redford's he's probably not a contemporary famous person, but for her, no, you're my Robert Redford, I guess.
Can I be the Sundance Kid then?
Yeah, I love that. I don't remember the other ones.
Okay, can I rob something?
Probably not.
Oh well.
In Infinite City, you write about the Pioneer Monument. You write, truth is the simplest of words and maybe the most demanding, the one that measures all other words. And then recently you say, truth is calling things by their true names. So what does truth mean, and what do the words we use have to do with it?
A lot of us had postmodernism sprinkled over us in college or graduate school, but there's a weird way the right has kind of weaponized all those notions of relativity, subjectivity, alienated signifiers and things like that. I think for science it means facts and empirical method. For journalism, which is what I was trained in at Berkeley, it means verifying your data and not saying anything that can't be verified, or being clear when you're a writer, an essayist like I am, between what you think might be true or what you wish was true, what you imagine is true, and what you know to be true, as in actually happened. And it feels like I'm going to talk about this upstairs, that part of there are specific political things we're struggling with against the Trump administration, but there is a kind of nihilism I wrote about it actually and Call Them by Their True Names, the ideology of isolation, a kind of free market, libertarianism, that facts true are free market commodities and you can have whichever ones you want and don't have to, and and I feel like that's one of the struggles that everybody who's a teacher, a preacher, a scientist, a professor, a librarian, is really trying to hold down this kind of Enlightenment idea of scientific method and documentable fact. And because once you lose that as the basis, you kind of can lose anything. And, this week has been full of hate crimes and violence, and the basis for them in part is fabrications, things that don't hold up to journalistic standards, evidentiary standards. And
even like the response, I just think of Donald Trump's response to the hate crimes. There should have been a guard at the synagogue, it's almost like that misdirection is part of it. It's almost like drawing the. Basically, what he said is there should have been a guard at the synagogue, and we need the death penalty to kill people like this.
That's, neither of which, they had a guard at Marjorie Stoneman High School. You don't actually, once somebody has an AK-47, they can do a great deal of damage. And it's interesting because part of the untruth is that guns are very effective offensive weapons that kill I think 33,000 Americans a year. And they're not very good defensive weapons. They're rarely successfully used in self-defense. I saw a statistic, I think the police miss 81% of the time when they shoot to kill, and those guys are trained and it's their job. And it's interesting because I feel like part of the fiction behind guns is too many Clint Eastwood movies and video games. And there is this notion of the rugged individual who doesn't need to depend on society for safety and can take it into his own hands. It works as a massacre strategy. It doesn't work as a defensive strategy. Right. But a lot of synagogues are spending a lot of money on security already.
Completely.
And
JCC
they're basically. I remember walking past the Jewish center in Paris during the Paris climate thing, and they had all these, actually the government there supplies the guards, but to see a bunch of men with machine guns out front was really intense, and when we hire security guards in this country, if they're armed, they're generally armed with, small weapons, not AK-47s.
Yeah.
And or AR-15s, excuse me.
Right.
And there's also, I feel like the whole the interpretation of the Second Amendment is a lie. The idea that all these mass deaths aren't related to the availability of guns and the rhetoric around them is a lie. And so, calling things by their true names means we then have a true conversation about what causes are, what effects are, etc. Right. And there's a way that gets sabotaged, and once you let the conversation be framed in fictitious terms, you've lost, no matter what you say.
Yeah, that's really true. I think so much about what you must have been like as a child. When I was a child, I loved the libraries. Do you know what I mean? And I loved all the librarians knew me by name, and I loved being the smell of the books and the nonfiction books and the fiction books. And I imagine even growing up to be a librarian when I was a kid. But I wondered what your experience was like as a child, and just what were you reading and what was influencing you, and when did you begin to think that you might be a writer, and how did that come into being?
I was entranced with stories and places even before I learned how to read. And I had this sense of boxes and of words. I remember looking at a billboard when I was 4 as this thing I couldn't access. And my mom says that I learned to read like the first week of first grade, and suddenly books were, I could open the box and access what was inside. Because a book, it is shaped a lot like a treasure chest. Yeah. And then I was off and running. In the first semester of first grade, I actually did want to be a librarian because they spend all day around books, and that's so great.
Exactly.
And then I realized somebody writes the books, and that was when I made my third and final career decision. The first pre-literate one was ballerina, and then librarian, and then I was going to write books. And what that meant and how you do it and stuff took another 15 years to get close to. But I love books, and I was a weird kid. I was a girl in a family of boys. We were a liberal, half-Jewish family in a kind of conservative, occasionally anti-Semitic town, Nevada, where all the San Francisco cops lived when I was growing up.
That's where my uncle lived.
Yeah, so Yeah. And it's a scary place with beautiful landscape all around it. I lived in the northernmost subdivision and really in the county. In those days, north of us was nothing but open space, and that was a refuge. And south of us was a really good public library, that one walking distance back when kids were free-range animals and you could go off by yourself. And so that's where I spent those two places. Go north for open space, go south to disappear into the other worlds of books. And the books were... And I read everything. I read my brother's sci-fi books. I read my parents' adult novels. I read the backs of cereal boxes and things, but the Narnia books.
Yeah, I love those books. I remember exactly where. I mean, it's not too many books there you remember exactly where you were sitting when you were reading. But I remember reading The Last Battle and the year I broke my arm during the summer, and I just remember all the feelings of being in this dark room and reading that book, and it's still with me.
There was a great guy, I think he was the special ed teacher, who knew I read lots of horse books, who handed me The Horse and His Boy, which is the Narnia book set in the anti-Muslim Kellermean land. But it is a great book, and I read that, and then I read all of them. and I was often running. And there was a wonderful bookstore owner who had a bookstore called Amber Griffin, a very 70s bookstore, who let me buy the books one at a time with my allowance and then gave me the box.
Oh, how nice.
And I've written
That's
about
so
them,
nice.
and like I still own those 7 books. It's all pretty kind of dog-eared and tattered, but I'm literally the only person who's ever touched them, I'm pretty sure. They are so smudged with the dirt of my dirty little hands. But I read horse books and, kind of trying to think. Zilphia Keatley Snyder, who is a great California fantasist.
Oh, yeah.
And her books actually had like live oaks and California stuff in
Yeah.
them. She wrote a great book about a fatherless boy who gets wings from an old magician, set here in San Francisco, called Black and Blue Magic, because he's a clumsy flyer and bashes into things. She wrote, and I'm trying to think, just all these people, all fairy tales, a book about goat husbandry, Japanese as well as Greek mythology, and really I was just like, like a caterpillar or a wool moth eating my way through everything. And
I felt the same way. I mean, and even when I had our own children, we read every picture book that was in the library, because we have 70 books out at a time, and we'd read 10 a night, and because picture books, you just and it changed my kind of visual literacy, just those books, because I really started seeing the world in a different way, because there's so much, because you have to read the pictures. Do you know what I mean?
Where you read a sentence and then you pause. It's kind of like postmodern theory.
Yeah, it is.
Only
reading
fun.
Derrida.
Yeah. Well, no, because when I was reading, still with philosophical things, it's like you read at a word, a sentence, or a paragraph, and then you have to kind of pause and interpret, digest, situate, and then you can go on. It's not like galloping through a novel.
Right.
Yeah.
One of my teachers was Larry Buell, he taught American history, or American literature at Harvard.
Yeah.
And what he loved was that romantic walking literature. And so when I found Wanderlust at the Harvard Coop in the year I had a baby, and I'd go walking every day, and I was reading Wanderlust as I went. And so reading about and when I moved to the suburbs, that's what I was reading. And it really helped me to understand why the suburbs felt so confining and so not human scale. But in that book, you write, walking is an indicator species for various kinds of freedoms and pleasures, free time, free and alluring space, and unhindered bodies. So you know more about that literature than almost anyone I've ever met. So
I did when I wrote that book 20 years ago.
20 years ago. But how does it inform your vision of things?
I think a lot about how people live, what kinds of spaces we make and how we inhabit them. There's a tendency by a lot of urban planners, and I've seen it with people working around pedestrian and bike space, to feel that infrastructure is God, build it and people will obey it. But one of the shocking things I've seen in San Francisco in my adult life is it go from a place where people really knew how to be urban, where people walked a lot, took a lot of public transit, et cetera, to, I think we have a lot of young people coming here from the suburbs who really think that a car must mediate all travel, which means that you're staying enclosed in that private space. And then also everybody's, we're living in a zombie movie where everyone's walking around like this. And one thing that happens is you don't make a lot of human contact. And I think a lot of young techie, we have multiple cultures. I moved into a black neighborhood in the Western Addition when I was 19 and really got schooled by a Southern black culture of interaction, of greeting people. I also got harassed a lot everywhere in San Francisco because I was a 19-year-old blonde girl. But there was a really warm thing in that neighborhood of people greeting each other and interacting that I really came to love and value, and I live in the Mission now and see it there. And but there is this white suburban thing of like, my privacy is sacred, don't violate it, don't make eye contact. And I see young techie people where if in New York or New Orleans, where I spent a lot of time, you can make a remark to someone on the street, just kind of like a wry remark about the crazy driver or the weird altercation. And here in San Francisco, people often look like, are you mistaken? Do you think you know me? Strangers must not speak to strangers. So there's that, but then there's also the fact that I think Silicon Valley has been a horrifically destructive force. And it's sad because I think the Bay Area was kind of a beacon it was a sanctuary for queer people and dissident and generally weird people anti-war people,
Yeah.
poets, all these things for a lot of its life. And, the Sierra Club was founded not very far from
Right,
here and stuff. And
yeah.
then the Sierra Club had to move to Oakland because of rent after 124 years, a couple years ago. But the fact that people also navigate by their phones, I had such an interesting experience. I went to New Orleans after Katrina with a Garmin device someone had given me back before phones did that, before phones were smart, and a $5 gas station map. I could have used the Garmin device 1,000 times and I would have still blindly obeyed its instructions. It was useful because there were a lot of streets without lights and without signs, 6 months after Katrina, and the many times I returned after that. But with the street map, digital cartography masters you and you obey it blindly like a servant. A map, you learn until you are the map. I learned my way around New Orleans, and as my partner can testify, I can navigate New Orleans. Like, I'll get lost, and the streets follow the bends of the Mississippi River, which goes north, south, east, and west as it wends its way through the city. But I know my way around generally, and the major streets and stuff. And that's because I used it. You use a map and then you wing it, and you have to memorize the map a little because you don't look at it all the time while you're driving or walking. And then you're like, well, here's the parallel streets, and here's the streets named after muses, and like in San Francisco, you learn the alphabetical streets and the avenues and things. And I feel like a lot of people no longer know where they are because they rely on their devices, so they're not paying attention. They're not becoming the atlases we all are when we know where we are, where we know where our friends live and how to get there, and 10 different ways to get to the park, and 6 different ways to, walk from here to there, and what the street names are and things like that.
I remember being at Berkeley and just choosing the most beautiful walk that you could take, like the most beautiful, like I wouldn't think, what's the fastest way to get to Dwinell Hall?
Yeah,
like,
did you go to Berkeley?
Yeah, I did. I loved
Go
it
Bears.
there. I just talk about walking, and walking up at Go Bears, walking up in Tilden Park, and it's like the best of the Bay Area right there. But I loved that you could just choose the most beautiful way of getting somewhere, so you could see the Golden Gate Bridge the most times. Or
the longest distance between 2 points is a good route, which is exactly what labyrinths are about in a way.
Yes.
And it was really walking your labyrinth before I wrote Wanderlust that I had the revelation that sometimes you have to turn your back on your destination to get there. Sometimes the only route involves all those, and it's what the labyrinth teaches you, is that to get to where you're going isn't necessarily going to be the shortest distance between 2 points, and that something maybe needs to happen on the way before you're ready to arrive.
Yeah, it's funny that the Labyrinth, I just like that book, Wanderlust, means so much to me. It's one of my favorite books ever.
Thank you.
But to think that you were on the Labyrinth as you were kind of thinking of it yourself, it's just like...
Well, and it's interesting because there's a lot of literature about labyrinths, but there's also the experience teaches you something, and that's kind of what I think the experience of walking does, observing the world around you, observing your own thoughts, which are in subtle ways shaped and directed, interrupted and enhanced by what's around you. That wonderful kind of rhythm of being lost in thought, and then like a stellar jay darts across your path, or you run into somebody or something surprises you, or or you
remember
and you come out of
thought,
or something you see makes you think something you wouldn't have thought otherwise. And there's a history of walking in relationship to thinking that makes me wonder, do people, do the young techie people staring at their phones understand that the distance that between two events is a space that's rich in wandering and getting lost and getting lost in thought? Because earbuds and things are all about the idea that this is empty and needs to be filled. It's like looking at a meadow and saying we need to build a mall here because there's nothing here.
Yeah.
And I think of the free space in our heads as being a kind of wilderness that busyness paves over and develops and often commercializes, since so much of what's in our heads now is tied to advertising and corporations and the way that search engines and social media are designed to make us cough up all our personal data and take in all the things that make us good consumers.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder if you have a place to recommend to walk in San Francisco, just for people who, it's a place that people might not think of. I mean, I remember going out to Land's End and not seeing anybody there for years and years. Now it's so crowded there. But I wonder if there's other places that you really love that you recommend for us to walk in.
I mean, Ocean Beach, I think trajectories are fun where you just go in a straight line up over a hill or something. There's a wonderful map maker who is at Stanford, and I met him on foot at Caltrain. We walked over, but he's rugged. We walked to the great map collector, David Rumsey, who lives near Golden Gate Park. So we walked over Potrero Hill, over Liberty Hill between Noe Valley and the Castro, and then over Buena Vista Hill to get there. And it was sort of it was the steepest distance between 2 points and stuff. But it's sort of like pick a destination. And it's also interesting when I wrote when I edited, wrote, commissioned, put together the San Francisco Atlas with my 30-something collaborators. One of the first things I did is spread out just like a AAA map of San Francisco, and I realized I know the city better than most people because I've been walking here since, really coming here as a kid, and then as a teenager going to punk shows, and then living here since I was 18. I moved here in 1980, and I've also written a number of books before the Atlas that deal with the city, and I realized that I'd literally not been to at least 50% of the city. Yeah. There's these people, I'm not sure I would recommend it because you have to be relentless and want to see everything, but there are people, mostly men I've heard about, who decide to walk every street in a city.
Like Gary Camilla, I think he's the kind of guy who does that.
And there are a lot of places like Excelsior and stuff that kind of aren't on the map of, there's the old city but...
Yeah, and there's a lot of places I just love the city because there's so much to explore. And I do think there's huge gray areas that aren't filled in my internal atlas. You know what I mean? I haven't been there.
Maybe you should have a dartboard map and some darts or something.
Yeah. Well, even if you didn't walk every street, but you walked every neighborhood at least. Yeah. I mean, that's doable.
Yeah.
I know that people are going to want to hear you talk a little bit about just violence against women. Yeah. That's one of the things my daughter and I share in common. She read Men Explain Things to Me, and I read it too. And it was in there you write a woman is sexually abused every 9 seconds in the United States.
Domestic violence, I think every 9 or 11 seconds, or about a rape a minute.
Yeah, and then you also mentioned too that pregnant women are most likely to die because they're getting killed by their spouses.
Yeah, gender violence by former and current partners is the leading cause of injury for women worldwide between the ages of 15 and 44.
And for such 30 years of their life, that's the number one. And what I loved about what you taught me as I read these sections, these essays. Thank you. Sometimes I can't. As I read these essays, was just our tendency to say, "Oh, that's an isolated incident."
Yeah.
Instead of just seeing the larger cultural whole, and that there are other societies that don't. Yeah. But I wonder if you can speak a little bit about that, because I know it's so much on our hearts and minds, and I wonder. I mean, it just seems like you call it a pandemic of violence, and I wonder if there's what our next steps are. How can we begin to make progress on that? It just seems enormously important.
I think we are. I've dealt with immense street harassment, as everyone who's been a young woman walking around on her own does. Whatever their hair color. I did make the blonde joke, but whatever their race, whatever their orientation, and I was really it was really here in San Francisco, which is supposed to be like all liberal, progressive, better than. And there was so much misogyny on the streets. I think I have a friend with a 15-year-old daughter who on Pacific Heights, and her daughter said something sarcastic back to a guy who's sexually harassing her and her friend this summer, and they immediately got the kind of death threat that I was getting then. And what happens when you get a death threat for not accepting somebody's right to sexually harass you. It really tells you it's not your world, it's not your city, your rights don't matter, he has power that you don't, he's asserting his power over you. And it's really, but what is exciting, and I wrote about it, my first cover story probably ever was the cover of Maximum Rock and Roll, the global punk rock magazine that functioned like a website for all these little punk communities in like Croatia and Bolivia and stuff, all these decades. And it's called War Against Women. And I was really trying to get people to recognize that this is an epidemic. And everything was treated around violence against women. We could not talk about it the way we talked about other kinds of hate crimes, as an epidemic, as something that's a pattern, as something that has cumulative effect, as something that affects a class of people, et cetera, is always either, is blame the victim, why was she with him, what was she wearing, why was she there, why didn't she do everything right, why wasn't she, an asexual superpower, rich person with whatever. And, you couldn't get people to talk about it. We almost talked about it when Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend were murdered.
Right.
But O.J. Simpson's lawyers cleverly made him the victim and made it about race. And that conversation kind of withered away, although apparently domestic violence reporting went up. Anita Hill did make us have a conversation about sexual harassment that was very important and doubled the level of reporting. But really until something happened, and I think it was, people keep treating Me Too like it's this new thing that just happened, and I think it's the culmination of decades of feminist work, and that what happened a year ago this month, and what more was an intensification of what's been happening for the last 6 years as feminism reached, and feminists and people who support feminism of all genders reached a critical mass to change the way we told the story, what stories we told, who we believed, who mattered. And it was the campus anti-rape activists who achieved a kind of momentum in 2012. It was the Steubenville sexual assault by high school students against one of their peers, the New Delhi rape, torture, murder. And those things really somehow, and there have been many things like that, many incidents like that, many responses, but suddenly we had a critical mass to say this is urgent, this is epidemic, we have to address it as a categorical, pervasive problem rather than treat each incident as isolated. And we began to have that conversation I've waited my whole life for. And Me Too, I feel, is the culmination of having women and feminist judges, women in feminist leadership at universities, at newspapers and television stations, and et cetera. There was a very striking story a year ago by a woman who said, I actually tried to blow the whistle on Harvey Weinstein at the New York Times, and my male editor said, I don't see why this is important, and killed the crucial parts of the story. And so and you think of all the women he assaulted between 2004 and 2017, and that's partly a lot of trauma could have been prevented.
Yeah.
But, and it's what's shocking is the silence. How did some of the most famous women in the world get these famous actresses, how were they rendered voiceless? And really the violence has always been against voice, the voice of to say I do not consent to this, whether it's campus assault or the rest of it, the voice to say this happened and have it be taken seriously and stuff like that. And there's been a war. Your voice is such a central part of who you are as a human being, and of your power to be part of a community, to be able to determine what happens to you, to set your own boundaries, to bear witness, and to have what you say have consequences. The reason so much violence against women has taken place is because women have been deprived of that audibility, credibility, and consequentiality to our voices. And that's changing, and not enough. We still have an epidemic, but we have recourse in many ways. But I think we only change. We can't punish or counter that violence out of existence. It's kind of like you can't have enough security guards at synagogues to make anti-Semitism go away. You have to treat the root causes. And I feel like what's also happening is people raising boys and people raising kids, school teachers, other people that were really, there's still a lot of people raising boys to feel like they don't need to respect others' rights, that they matter more than other people and stuff. But there's a lot of people who are doing it otherwise, and I'm seeing a lot of people around me doing it differently. The books that kids read, some of them are different, etc. My godson's grandmother keeps giving him books on trucks, and I'm his godmother partly because his parents really wanted a feminist.
That's good.
Formally attached to him for life. But his mom has decided she can deal with the truck books by reading them all with female pronouns. And so we have now entered the era of female trucks. So, but I think that there's a lot of the work is not, I think punishment matters, that some of the people, seeing that Bill Cosby went to jail, that Harvey Weinstein may go to jail, it may check their sense that they can get away with this, which is part of how they do it, that, they do it partly because they can, and they do it as a demonstration of their power and the lack of power of their victims, power itself being a kind of erotic subject under patriarchy and the powerlessness of women. But it is changing. And I think we're dealing with something that's thousands of years old. So the fact that we haven't completely solved it in the last 50 years of feminism doesn't dismay me. The fact that we've done so much, I think, is amazing. The backlash does dismay me, and that's what the Trump administration, the alt-right, which is as misogynist as it is homophobic and racist, the whole sort of underbelly of incels and kind of hate porn and revenge porn and the sort of weird world of misogyny on Reddit and 4chan and Gamergate, which was kind of an entryway for the alt-right some years back, and all that stuff still exists as a kind of backlash against women having more power
It's
in the real
interesting.
world.
Sometimes I've been thinking about. We just had Robert Sapolsky was our forum guest 3 weeks ago. And he was
I need to come here more.
Oh, you do. There's so much great things happening here.
Episcopalian primates, what a concept.
Yeah, well, that's right, completely. That's exactly right. Primates. That's exactly what I'm thinking. And I told him, I said, I'm going to write a book called Primate Theology. In a way, it's about reminding us of just. I mean, we could have kind of like such a detached view from all the other species that we forget that we are animals too, and that's part of our new consciousness too, is to recognize that we have these animal parts of ourselves that are just not under the umbrella of reason in quite the same
I think
kind of
they
way.
are actually, because I think patriarchy and misogyny are socially constructed,
Yeah.
not innate. And a lot of, one of the great blessings of my life is being a San Franciscan and thereby being around gay men all my adult life and seeing what else you can be with those chromosomes and those hormones.
Right.
And
He talks about, what is it? Displacement aggression. So it's not so much about just, I don't think he would say that we're gender determined, but he does talk about just that aggressiveness, that aggression. It's just something we need to pay attention to. It's not like we could say, we're primates, so we can go ahead and punch people. It's more like we're primates, so we have to realize that there's going to be a part of our brain that's going to be satisfied by punching somebody. You know what I mean? I think that's what because he cares so much about human dignity and showing. I mean, his whole sermon was basically saying we share so much in common. We can bond with our pets so deeply, and yet we share so much more genetic material with other humans. And why can't we treat our humans in the way that we treat our beloved pets?
Pets are so easy.
They are. Dogs are so sweet. I could watch dog videos all day long.
Wolves rendered as perpetual puppies.
Yeah.
But there is something I from both elephants and I think baboons that they've learned that actually they're very malleable. There's a story about a herd of elephants where all the adult males had been killed, leaving the young males, some of you may have heard this story, kind of no model for how to be adult males, and it becoming a very violent herd. And them actually curing it by sending some mature males with more peaceable habits out there. And there's another story about baboons where they left somehow a herd of baboons without the kind of aggressor males, where even among baboons, how they behave, how aggressive and violent they are is very malleable. Human beings are extraordinarily
definitely.
malleable.
Yeah.
We have matrilineal societies and
Exactly,
societies in which anger is considered kind of an embarrassing lack of self-control versus societies that think your anger is, your masculinity.
Right.
And in this society, we have many versions of what it means to be human and many competing sets of values. And I feel like that malleability is really hopeful. What is not inherent and determined, can take other forms and has.
Yeah. I really like that. I've been thinking so much about just all the books that you've written and just all that you know, and especially about the Trump administration in the Red Book, your latest one.
Oh my God, my little red book. It sounds so Maoist.
It does, actually. I hadn't thought about it in that way before.
Sort of coral colored, but yeah.
It is. I like it feels good, too. Oh, and here's the chapter I was talking about right here, this
The
chapter.
Loneliness of Donald Trump.
Yeah. So what I was thinking about is just, we're almost through 2 years of this, and I think it's having like a major psychological effect on everyone in our society. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what you expected, about having a Trump administration when the election first happened, and then maybe what surprised you about how things have been, under this new regime.
Once it became clear on election night what had happened, my greatest fear was that it was going to be like the Bush era. People would be afraid, and the Bush era right after 9/11, people would be afraid to dissent. And those of us who have relatively comfortable lives would retreat into, well, I'm okay and I'm afraid to speak up. And one of the good things about this administration is it hasn't been able to weaponize patriotism. They have a very committed base that's probably a third or less of the population. And the Women's March was, and then the next week, that amazing arrival of huge numbers of us at the airports around the country to protest the Muslim ban was the sign that people were not going to be too afraid to speak up. And what we've had, which is something I never expected, is more resistance, more popular dissent and opposition, more demonstrations, and not just the really big ones in big cities. And there's a weird way the Women's March was represented. It was white, and it was sort of managed in Washington, D.C. There was actually a bigger march that was a whole lot less white in Los Angeles. I was in San Francisco with our Muslim migrant friends, on a very rainy afternoon. And and there were women's marches in little towns in Alaska and North Dakota. My friend Erica Chenoweth has taken upon herself to start the crowd counting consortium, and the first thing she counted was the Women's March, and crunched the data on the 5,000 plus demonstrations to say this is almost certainly the single largest protest in American history. Wow. So there has been this tremendous insurgence, and I'm going to talk about this in I guess it's a sermon. Is it a sermon? A sermon. The sort of Buddhist Catholic Jew is going to give a sermon in an Episcopalian cathedral because life is weird with her Hindu and Muslim friends.
Completely.
And
that's my dream right there. I just think this is going to be great.
And what was I going to say? But so it's that people are not afraid has been really encouraging, or that they've overcome that fear. And I think people who are migrant, who are trans, who are Muslim, who are being targeted, I'm not saying that they have every reason to be afraid, but like that people have not been afraid to stand up with and for those groups, and to insist on not being separate, to not be like, well, I'm not, that whole... Right. What's that minister? They came for the Muslims, but I wasn't a Muslim.
Right, exactly.
Caitlyn Jenner is just having that rude awakening. But whoever we are not Caitlyn Jenner mostly. And who kind of soft pedaled, was pro Donald Trump even as a trans woman, and then was like I didn't really think they'd come for me, which is what a lifetime of privilege may have
Yeah, no,
left her unprepared for.
I love that idea of weaponizing patriotism too, because you're right. I don't feel like there's a sense of being unpatriotic when you're being critical of the current administration, and maybe that's partly where I live and partly my own situation.
I think it is hard in some places. Who was telling me about a friend in small town Wisconsin who's like the one outspoken person? I think also social media has developed in a different way than it was then, so that, just the same way that gay kids in small conservative communities can find it gets better support online, that people know online that they're not alone in this dissent. And also it is the Democrats can always be better, but there have been a lot of powerful, outspoken people. The LA contingent of Ted Lieu, Adam Schiff, and Maxine Waters has been amazing. And we do have, and partly also even, 15 years after 9/11, this is a really different country demographically. It's much less white and much further along, I think, in this evolution. Feminism has had a lot of success. Rights for gay people has had a lot of success since in these 16 years. Yeah. The future of the U.S. is not white. In 2045, we become a minority, which I think is kind of awesome.
Yeah, me too. Jeff Chang was here 2 weeks ago.
Really?
Here's what he said.
We need to come here. You have the greatest people.
I mean, Jeff Chang was amazing.
Jeff. Oh, yeah. He's a friend, and
he's my classmate at Berkeley.
Really?
Yeah. But anyways, what he said was this. He said Arizona is where California was in 1995. Yeah. And that really helped me understand what was going on. I mean, to think of, Pete Wilson obviously Donald Trump is no Pete Wilson, but it did give me a different frame in which to see what's happening around us.
And Arizona and Texas are interesting because they're going to be Latino majority states, and they're pretty close. And in Arizona, whiteness is old and brownness is young.
Exactly.
And there is an interesting thing. And I was looking at a lot yesterday around this massacre in the synagogue, which I'll be talking about, and reading the names and stuff. But there is this fear of not being the dominant majority. Yeah. And it's interesting because it feels like it comes out of a need to dominate and a sense that if you're not dominant, you're not safe.
Yes.
And it's sort of like, there's ways we have to fight back because it's a war, and there's ways that we have to make it not a war. And we kind of have, we have to win the election a week from Tuesday, but we also have to, it's kind of like what I said about male violence, that I think that law enforcement and credibility and campus rape activism and all these things are good, but ultimately we have to make the idea of violating another human being both inconceivable and repulsive to the people who now think it somehow enhances their masculinity to do it.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that ultimately that's what ends this uncivil war, is bringing them over and letting people lose that fear. And I'm excited about a non-white future because all the polls we have now show that in terms that non-white people are much more progressive on climate change, the environment, social services, taking care of the vulnerable.
Everything, we may be a more humane society as a result.
Yeah, we now have clarity that white people are the problem. In terms
you look at the
white
violence
people,
that we've been.
But it's like the Republican Party is a white people party. Support for a lot of these really monstrous things is largely a white position. And, about 20-something% of Asians and Latinos did vote for Trump.
Yeah.
I think less than 4% of black women. And, far more white men than white women.
Yeah.
And,
I'm so glad that helps me so much to understand that mystery of just like that dominance and that insecurity. Yeah. It's white fragility, basically. And that's part of what I love.
But it's white fragility that assumes it's all war and that we're, and it has a kind of competitive model. Like, since I want to take everything from you when I'm powerful, I assume when you're powerful, you want to take everything from me.
Yeah.
Been thinking about this Ray Bradbury story. I haven't read since I was a kid, but it's like we destroy Earth and settle Mars. It's very much the rocket ship era of sci-fi. But black people have somehow become the dominant. Do you remember that one? They become the dominant population on Mars. White people as refugees are arising, and black people are deciding, are we going to send those people to the back of the bus? Are we going to have a reverse Jim Crow?
Right.
And they just don't have the heart to do it. And it's this beautiful Ray Bradbury, because he was this kind of LA liberal progressive
I just
dreamer.
read Stranger in a Strange Land within the last 10 years. It was good to read things you read as a child again, I think.
And it does have a lot of Playboy Mansion qualities to
does,
it.
You're totally right.
But,
it does, completely. Smokers' jackets and whatnot.
Yeah, and voluptuous, willing babes. And
right.
With first names.
Yeah, with first names.
But it really, but the Bradbury story is really interesting, and it's really like South Africa after apartheid, and it's interesting. I've been thinking about what we've been having with Me Too is like a truth without reconciliation. And I've been talking, actually, I had an amazing visit. I was just at Boston University Wednesday, and I was the guest of a man whose focus has been a kind of truth and reconciliation process in Ireland, a devoutly Catholic country that was so viciously punitive of unwed mothers with the Magdalene laundries. And one of the things they've had to do is recognize the mass graves of children who somehow died in the care of nuns in Tuam in the west of Ireland. And there's and I don't know if they're, what that will look like, but they've created a space for all these women and there's a way that the fact that nobody, and whether you deal with anti-abortion movement or with these women who are forced to become kind of nameless, silenced, disappeared from society, shamed slave labor in these laundries, they're bringing them back to tell their stories. But one of the things that he talked about that really kind of shocked me, and there's a wonderful Mormon woman who did this long string of tweets that went viral. Nobody ever gets pregnant on her own, except you're an expert on this, maybe. Well, the Virgin Mary did not get pregnant on her own, but it wasn't a dude
it's the
exactly.
Ultimate thing that happens.
It wasn't a dude. So we have one exception,
right.
but the fact that none of these pregnancies happens, you can become pregnant without a man with the help of a laboratory and a sperm bank and things like that, but no, there are no accidental pregnancies that men are not involved in. And it was really kind of shocking to hear him talk about the fact that nobody's ever addressed that all of these women forced into the Magdalene laundries got pregnant by someone. Where are the men? And the same with abortion. If impregnating, all these punishments they want for women who want abortions, if they were for men who impregnated women who didn't want to have pregnancies, we would be living in another galaxy. But it was interesting just hearing this truth and reconciliation process, this process we have that is also happening around Native American voices, and that has been a huge influence on me, of spaces often created by the people who've been silenced, creating their own spaces to tell their stories. So in Ireland, the Magdalene laundry survivors are coming to these conferences and telling their stories, and it's kind of this national truth and reconciliation thing. So I feel like we don't have reconciliation, which is when the victimizers have to participate, have to acknowledge what they've done, have to listen. But we do have, and that's, nobody's writing about, how I raped her.
Right.
And I suspect a lot of the women in the Magdalene laundries were rape and molestation victims too. But we are changing, and it is
Yeah.
encouraging.
Naomi Tutu was here last week, and she
Yeah.
talked about truth and reconciliation processes.
Yeah.
And she said they work best on the most local level.
Yeah.
And then she also said, there are ways, there are like creative racial reconciliation things that we could do just around,
Yeah.
African Americans who served as GIs, and kind of like a
Yeah.
renewed GI Bill for them, et cetera. One of the things we do, I forgot to tell you about this
Yeah.
beforehand, we take questions.
Oh,
So
I saw.
there may be questions. There's like a
Rebecca
little
told
note
me.
card on your seat that you may want to write a question down. And then Rebecca Nessel is collecting those. She's already getting some
Wow,
from the
we've got
people who are
lots.
here. I know, tons. Before we move to these, I wanted to ask you about two kinds of questions. About inequality was one. Like why, inequality is something that we can do something about through the tax code.
Yeah.
Why do we persist in making our society so much more unequal over the last 30 years? That was one kind of branch of questions I had. And then another branch of questions was just about nuclear weapons. I mean, we just seem to be moving backwards with in terms of our care for abolishing nuclear weapons. And I know you've thought so much about that. I was wondering if you had something to say about those two issues.
Nuclear weapons is so big. I don't think I'll address it, partly because the other question is so interesting.
Yeah.
We've had. A lot of you look like you're at least as old as me. I now look back on the 1970s as a kind of socialist utopia, because it's the closest this country ever came to economic equality, in that corporations and wealthy people paid a lot of taxes.
Yeah.
And we had sort of maximum amount of social services. Healthcare, education, and housing were not crises for a lot of people, resulting in bankruptcy, homelessness, untreated illnesses, etc. The University of California was still almost free. California still had the best free public educational system, in the country and arguably in the world, and etc.
Yeah, it was $620 a semester was our tuition.
Yeah. And and there's two things there. One is the kind of scarcity, the tax cuts, which have mostly benefited the corporations and rich, but conservative people were convinced to buy into tax cuts with the idea that, to get biblical on you, I am not my brother's keeper. I don't owe anybody anything. The poor are deadbeats who are poor by their own, moral failings and deserve to be punished. And I'm not connected to people not like me, so people who are not my race or religion or, now political orientation. But there's a deep sense of poverty in all that there's not enough. I can't afford to contribute. I wish we could come up with another sort of name for taxes as a contribution to, the kind of the public trust and general well-being. And
because there's two ways to do it. You either borrow money from rich people, or you tax people.
Yeah.
And so it's got to be one of those two things.
Yeah, and there was a weird way also that everyone thought that tax money went to, welfare queens and artists making scandalous artwork or something, rather than, if we didn't have the world's largest military, we would have so much money to spend on good things, and we're still we could do it all. But there's also something I've been so interested in as a writer, which is trying to find the language to value things that aren't quantifiable. And I think, for example, around climate change, people are convinced that there's a great renunciation in leaving fossil fuels behind, but fossil fuels are poisonous at every stage we use them. And to have confidence in the future is a kind of wealth that you don't have with runaway climate change. To have, healthy water and air is a kind of wealth that's collective and not individual. To have, to feel secure in your community, because there's not a lot of guns and violence, is a kind of wealth. And so finding the language, and I think it's your job and my job to find the language to get people to recognize other kinds of ways in which we in the United States, including those of us who are middle class and have lots of money and things, are poor because we live in a society, a violent society, a fearful society, a society with a lot of hate, a society with a lot of loneliness and alienation. Like, what are these intangible wealths that we would have if everything was different? Bill McKibben's Deep Economy is a beautiful picture of how responding to climate change requires us to become much more deeply situated in our communities, to literally decentralize power by how we produce electricity as we move to an all-electric society, but that which also takes away the monstrosity of the fossil fuel powers that are the Saudi government, the Koch brothers, Exxon, Chevron, the role of fossil fuel in warping the U.S. government, and the Russian, Russia is a petrostate essentially, and that's a lot of Putin's agenda is around maximizing profit off fossil fuel, which is part of why he supported Trump and corrupted our election and stuff. So you see, all these ways that we're poor that we don't know because, if wealth is described as just having lots of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what we need to address. And I think someone like Beto O'Rourke, some of the more visionary politicians address it now, but I think we need to do a better job. And it's present in some ways as true cost accounting and stuff, but it's not.
Do you remember, did you ever read Eco City Berkeley by Richard Register?
I didn't.
That kind of reminds me of that. It's like a 70s, 80s book.
Yeah.
So I've collected a few questions, and I have to confess something, that the reason I always sit in this chair is there's the clock that's up on the wall there.
Oh, okay.
And it's not working.
Time stood still. It just sounded like I was talking forever.
It did. So time stood still for me.
Okay.
Can you imagine? I'm so embarrassed that it could
really
actually
funny.
stop like that.
Okay.
And I wouldn't even notice. Do you know what I mean? I guess it moves more slowly. But I feel badly because all of our friends, that one is correct.
Yeah.
I asked them to put that one in there so that I wasn't the only one who got to see what time it
Yeah.
was. But we have some lovely questions here, but we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But one question that's just a very simple one on the top of this is, what does hope look like? Is kind of a question to begin to wrap things up. We have 2 minutes. We have to stop on time.
Two-minute hope.
We have to stop on time because you have to get ready.
This will be soft-boiled hope, not hard-boiled hope. And hope is a sense of possibility, and it's acceptance that the future is deeply uncertain. My partner and I went to see Wings of Desire, that beautiful movie made about Berlin.
That's one of my favorite
and Angels
films.
in Berlin, and mine too, in 1988. And
Wim Wenders.
Yeah, and what's amazing watching that movie in 2018 is when that movie was made, the Berlin Wall, for all intents and purposes, seemed, if not immortal, at least inexorable. Like, people really thought that the Cold War divide of the Soviet bloc and and the capitalist bloc, what might last another 100 or 1,000 years. In 1988, nobody saw that. It had 1 year to go.
Yeah.
And so hope is about coming to terms with uncertainty. Both optimism and pessimism are a form of, and despair. Despair turns a feeling into an analysis. We know what is and isn't going to happen. Pessimism is that everything's going to the dogs no matter what we do, so it completely gets you off the hook. And optimism is everything's going to be fine, and it also completely gets you off the hook. My version of hope is just this sense of coming to terms with uncertainty and all the possibility implicit in that, with the tremendous responsibility that gives us to change the outcome. And I said a week or two ago in response to this, like, don't ask what will happen. We are what will happen.
Yeah, right. Oh.
And that's where, that might be a place to leave us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Next week, please join us. We'll be having as our guest Elizabeth Rosner. She'll be talking about Survivor Cafe, a work of nonfiction, which looks at the legacy of trauma and the labyrinth of memory. And I'm so excited that we get to keep Rebecca for just a little bit more, that she'll be preaching the 11 o'clock sermon upstairs. And what did you say? It was like a Buddhist, Jewish,
Well, my
Catholic.
friends are coming. I've got Buddhist,
Every
Catholic,
religion.
Muslim, and Jewish friends
Yeah.
coming, as well as someone whose mother was baptized by the Archbishop of Canterbury for balance.
Good, good. But so she'll be
Which sort of
preaching-
like is like, there's nothing more Anglican than that.
No,
is
there
there?
isn't.
No.
You can't.
No,
Again,
no,
that's
no.
the like, absolute
Yeah.
peak. So she'll be preaching at the 11 o'clock service. We have a little box to take your donations. If you can leave a donation, it'll help us keep everything going. And please join with me in thanking Rebecca for a delightful morning.